Margaret Chen had always been proud of her late husband's military service, but she never expected that displaying his medals and decorations would turn her into the most controversial resident on Maple Street. The 72-year-old widow had moved to the quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago, seeking peace and community after decades of military life that had taken her and Colonel James Chen to bases across 3 continents. When Margaret first hung the shadow box containing James's Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Combat Infantry badge in her front window, she thought it would be a simple tribute to the man who had given 30 years of his life to his country. The display case, crafted by a local woodworker, held not just the medals, but also James's final promotion certificate to full colonel, a folded American flag from his funeral, and a small photograph of him in dress uniform taken just months before his deployment to Afghanistan. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Margaret was watering her carefully tended rose garden. Her next-door neighbor, Patricia Williams, a sharp-tongued woman in her 50s, who seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves, stopped at the property line with her arms crossed and a disapproving frown. "I hate to be the one to tell you this, Margaret," Patricia said in a voice that suggested she actually enjoyed being exactly that person. "But people in the neighborhood are talking. That display in your window with all those shiny medals and such, it's quite elaborate. Almost too elaborate, if you know what I mean." Margaret set down her watering can, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry. What do you mean by too elaborate? They're my husband's military decorations. He served his country with honor." Patricia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, honey, we all know how easy it is to buy those things online these days. Military surplus stores, eBay, you name it. The whole neighborhood is buzzing about it. Some folks are saying it's disrespectful to real veterans to put on such a show." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had buried her husband just 18 months ago, had folded that flag herself as the honor guard presented it to her at Arlington Cemetery, had listened as the bugler played taps while her children wept beside her. The idea that anyone would think she was somehow fabricating James's service record was not just insulting, it was devastating. "Mrs. Williams," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, "my husband served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. He was wounded twice and received commendations for his leadership during some of the most dangerous operations of the war. I would never dishonor his memory or any other veteran by displaying fake medals." But Patricia was already shaking her head, her expression one of practiced patience with someone she clearly considered delusional. "Look, Margaret, I'm sure you believe that. Maybe someone sold you a story along with all those decorations. But the thing is, real heroes don't usually have quite so many medals, and they certainly don't put them on display like some kind of trophy case. It's just not how genuine military families behave." As Patricia walked away, leaving Margaret standing among her roses with tears stinging her eyes, the widow realized that this was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the whispers became more obvious. Neighbors who had initially greeted her with polite waves now averted their eyes when she appeared. The mailman, who had always paused for friendly chats, suddenly seemed to be in a hurry whenever he reached her address. The situation escalated when Margaret received a visit from the Homeowners Association president, Robert Martinez, a stern man in his 60s who took his volunteer position very seriously. He arrived on a Saturday morning with a clipboard and an air of official authority that made Margaret's heart sink before he even opened his mouth. "Mrs. Chen," he said, consulting his notes importantly, "I've received several complaints about the display in your front window. The association has standards about what can be visible from the street, and there are concerns about the authenticity and appropriateness of military paraphernalia being used for decorative purposes." Margaret invited him in, hoping that seeing the rest of James's military memorabilia might help him understand the genuine nature of the display. Her living room told the story of a military family's life. Photographs of James with his units, letters of commendation from superior officers, a shadow box containing his deployment patches and certificates recognizing his contributions to various military operations. But Martinez seemed unimpressed, even more suspicious. "Mrs. Chen, I have to be honest with you. This is an awful lot of military items for one person. The neighbors are concerned that you might be, well, embellishing your late husband's service record. It's becoming a distraction for the community, and frankly, it's disrespectful to actual veterans who live quietly and humbly." "Mr. Martinez," Margaret said, pulling out a thick folder from her desk. "Here are James's discharge papers, his service record, letters from his commanding officers, and documentation for every medal he received. You're welcome to examine them." Martinez barely glanced at the papers. "Mrs. Chen, these days anything can be forged or bought online. What we need is for you to remove the display from the window. It's causing tension in the neighborhood, and the association has the authority to ensure community harmony." When Margaret refused, explaining that the window display was her way of honoring her husband's memory and that she had every right to display genuine military decorations in her own home, Martinez's demeanor became coldly formal. He informed her that the association would be reviewing her case and that further action might be necessary if she continued to be uncooperative. After he left, Margaret sat in her living room surrounded by the evidence of her husband's distinguished career and felt more alone than she had since the day they lowered his casket into the ground. She thought about James, who had led soldiers through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world, who had earned the respect of generals and privates alike, who had never sought glory but had served with quiet dignity and unwavering courage. The next morning brought a new humiliation when Margaret discovered that someone had left an anonymous note in her mailbox. Written in block letters on plain paper, it read, "Stop lying about your fake hero husband. Real veterans don't need to show off. Take down your fake display or we will take it down for you." Margaret's hands shook as she read the words. In all her years as a military wife, moving from base to base, dealing with deployments, and the constant uncertainty of military life, she had never felt as attacked and isolated as she did at that moment. The community she had hoped would become her peaceful retirement home had turned into a place where her husband's service was questioned and his memory was dishonored. She called her daughter Sarah, who lived 3 states away, and tried to explain what was happening without breaking down completely. Sarah was furious and wanted to drive down immediately to confront the neighbors, but Margaret discouraged her. This was something she needed to handle herself, though she had no idea how. That afternoon, while Margaret was picking up groceries, she overheard 2 women talking in the checkout line ahead of her. One was Patricia Williams, and she was holding forth to her companion about the situation on Maple Street. "I'm telling you, Linda, it's getting out of hand," Patricia was saying. "She's got medals and flags and military pictures everywhere. It's like she's trying to convince herself that her story is real. The poor woman probably believes it by now, but the rest of us can see right through it. Nobody has that many decorations unless they're buying them at flea markets." Margaret stood frozen behind them, her own groceries forgotten, as Patricia continued. "The Homeowners Association is going to have to take action soon. We can't have people making a mockery of real military service. My own brother served in Vietnam, and he came home with 1 small medal that he keeps in a drawer. That's how real veterans behave, with dignity and humility, not like they're running some kind of military museum." When Patricia turned and saw Margaret standing there, her face flushed slightly, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she lifted her chin defiantly and said, "Oh, hello, Margaret. I hope you're considering what we discussed about your window display." Margaret managed to whisper, "My husband earned every one of those medals," before turning and leaving her cart in the aisle, walking out of the store with as much dignity as she could muster while her world crumbled around her. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with James's service record spread across the table. She read through the citations for his medals, remembering the stories he had told her about the actions that earned them. The Bronze Star had come after he led a rescue mission to extract wounded soldiers under heavy fire. The Purple Heart marked the day an improvised explosive device had torn through his convoy, leaving him with shrapnel wounds and a traumatic brain injury that had taken months to heal. These weren't just pieces of metal and ribbon. They were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and service that had cost her husband his health and, ultimately, his life. The traumatic brain injury from his final deployment had led to the early-onset dementia that had slowly stolen him away from her over the last 3 years of his life. By the time he died, he sometimes didn't remember his own name, but he never forgot that he had been a soldier. As Margaret sat surrounded by the documentation of James's service, she made a decision. She would not remove the display from her window. She would not allow the memory of her husband's sacrifice to be diminished by the ignorance and cruelty of people who had never understood what military families endured. Whatever the homeowners association decided to do, whatever threats her neighbors made, she would continue to honor James in the way she saw fit. But as she prepared for bed that night, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of her troubles. The anonymous note had carried an underlying threat that made her genuinely nervous about what might happen next. She had never imagined that displaying her husband's legitimate military decorations would turn her into a pariah in her own neighborhood. Little did Margaret know that her decision to stand firm would soon attract the attention of someone who would change everything, someone whose own military credentials were so unquestionable that even her harshest critics would be forced to acknowledge the truth about Colonel James Chen's distinguished service record. The harassment escalated over the following weeks in ways that Margaret could never have imagined. What had started as whispered conversations and disapproving looks had transformed into a coordinated campaign that seemed designed to drive her from the neighborhood entirely. The anonymous notes became a daily occurrence, each one more threatening than the last. Someone had apparently rallied others to their cause, because Margaret began finding multiple notes each morning, all written in different handwriting styles but carrying the same message of hostility and disbelief. On a particularly difficult Wednesday morning, Margaret discovered that someone had thrown eggs at her front window during the night, leaving sticky yellow stains across the glass that displayed James's medals. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. They were literally trying to cover up her husband's service record with their contempt. As she cleaned the mess with trembling hands, her neighbor across the street, Tom Bradley, called out from his yard. "Maybe that's a sign you should listen to, Margaret," he said loudly enough for several other neighbors to hear. "The whole street knows you're putting on some kind of show with those fake medals. Why don't you just admit it and take them down before this gets any worse?" Margaret turned to face him, her cleaning cloth dripping with egg residue. "Mr. Bradley, for the last time, these are my husband's legitimate military decorations. He served our country with honor, and I have every right to display them in my own home." Tom shook his head dismissively. "Look, lady, I've got friends who served in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all over. None of them came back with a display case full of shiny medals like some kind of war movie hero. Real soldiers don't need to prove anything to anybody. What you've got in that window looks like something from a costume shop." The conversation was overheard by several neighbors, including Patricia Williams, who had emerged from her house at the first sign of drama. She nodded approvingly at Tom's words and added her own commentary. "It's sad, really," Patricia said in a voice loud enough to carry down the street. "She probably doesn't even realize how obvious it is. I feel sorry for her, but we can't let her turn our neighborhood into some kind of circus with her fantasy military collection." Margaret felt the familiar sting of tears, but this time they came with a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. For months, she had tried to respond to their accusations with patience and dignity, hoping that eventually they would see reason or at least show her basic human decency. But their cruelty seemed to be escalating rather than diminishing, and she was beginning to understand that no amount of evidence or explanation would change their minds. The situation reached a new low the following weekend when Margaret came home from grocery shopping to find that someone had vandalized her car. The word liar had been keyed across the driver's side door, and all 4 tires had been deflated. As she stood in her driveway surveying the damage, several neighbors had gathered to watch from their yards, but none offered help or expressed outrage at the destruction. Margaret called the police, but the responding officer, a young man named Dave Sullivan, seemed skeptical of her account from the moment he arrived. After taking photographs and filling out a report, he pulled Margaret aside for what he called an honest conversation. "Mrs. Chen," Officer Sullivan said, consulting his notepad, "I've got to ask you directly, is there any chance that your neighbors might have legitimate concerns about those military decorations you've got displayed? I mean, there's been a lot of controversy about stolen valor and fake military credentials lately. People get pretty upset about that kind of thing." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Officer Sullivan, are you suggesting that I've somehow faked my husband's military service? I have his discharge papers, his service record, documentation for every medal. I can show you certificates signed by commanding officers, letters of commendation, photographs of him with his units." Sullivan shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm not saying anything one way or the other, ma'am. I'm just trying to understand why your neighbors are so worked up about this. Usually when there's this much community upset about something, there's some kind of legitimate concern behind it." When Margaret offered to bring out James's service documentation, Sullivan declined to review it, saying that authentication of military records wasn't within his area of expertise. He promised to file the vandalism report, but made it clear that without witnesses or physical evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator, there was little chance of finding whoever was responsible. After the officer left, Margaret sat in her vandalized car and finally allowed herself to cry in a way she hadn't since James's funeral. The loneliness was overwhelming, but worse than that was the realization that she was completely powerless to defend her husband's memory against people who had already decided she was a fraud. No amount of documentation seemed to matter to anyone. No evidence of James's service would convince people who had decided that her display was too elaborate, too impressive, too much to be believed. That evening, Margaret called her son Michael, who was stationed in Germany with his own military unit. Michael had followed in his father's footsteps, becoming an army officer, and he was devastated to learn what his mother was enduring. "Mom, this is insane," Michael said, his voice tight with anger. "Dad's service record is impeccable. Anyone with basic knowledge of military decorations would be able to verify that his medals are legitimate. What these people are doing is harassment, pure and simple." Michael wanted to take emergency leave to come home and confront the neighbors personally, but Margaret discouraged him. She didn't want her son's military career affected by her problems, and she was afraid that the situation might escalate into something even worse if emotions got too heated. "I can handle this, Michael," she told him, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "I just need to find a way to make them understand the truth about your father's service." But the harassment continued to intensify. Someone started calling Margaret's home phone at all hours, hanging up when she answered or playing recordings of military funeral music as if to mock her loss. Her mailbox was vandalized repeatedly, with messages like "stolen valor" and "fake widow" spray-painted across it. The Homeowners Association sent her increasingly threatening letters about the disruptive display in her window and warned that they were prepared to take legal action if she didn't comply with their demands to remove it. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening when Margaret heard voices outside her house and looked through her front window to see a group of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Patricia Williams was there, along with Tom Bradley, Robert Martinez from the Homeowners Association, and several other residents she recognized from the neighborhood. They were pointing at her house and speaking animatedly, and their body language suggested that they were working themselves up to some kind of action. Margaret watched in horror as Tom Bradley approached her front door with what appeared to be a crowbar in his hand. He called out loudly, "Margaret, we're tired of waiting for you to do the right thing. If you won't take down that fake display, we'll take care of it ourselves. You've had plenty of chances to stop this charade." "This has gone on long enough," Patricia added, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. "We're not going to let you continue to disrespect real veterans with your costume shop medals and made-up stories." Margaret grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she watched her neighbors organize what appeared to be an attempt to force their way into her home. She had never imagined that displaying her husband's legitimate military decorations would lead to a situation where she felt physically threatened by the people who lived around her. As she waited for police to arrive, Margaret clutched the photograph of James that she kept on her mantle. In the picture, he was smiling in his dress uniform, proud and confident, ready to serve his country wherever duty called him. She wondered what he would think of this situation, how he would handle neighbors who questioned his service and threatened his widow. James had always been a problem solver, someone who could find diplomatic solutions to the most complex challenges. But James wasn't there to help her navigate this nightmare, and Margaret was beginning to wonder if she would have to sell her house and move away just to escape the harassment. The idea of being driven from her home by bullies and ignorant neighbors filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. She had done nothing wrong. She had moved to this neighborhood seeking peace and community, and instead had found herself under attack for honoring her husband's memory. When the police arrived this time, they found the group of neighbors still gathered outside Margaret's house, though Tom Bradley had put away his crowbar, and they were maintaining a pretense of simply having a neighborhood discussion. The same Officer Sullivan responded to the call, and he seemed annoyed to be dealing with what he clearly considered an ongoing neighborhood dispute rather than a legitimate police matter. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you," Sullivan said after speaking briefly with the gathered neighbors. "This situation isn't going to resolve itself as long as you keep that display in your window. Your neighbors feel strongly that you're being disrespectful to genuine veterans, and they're not going to back down. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you just removed the decorations and found some other way to honor your husband's memory." Margaret looked at Officer Sullivan in disbelief. "You're asking me to remove my husband's legitimate military decorations from my own home because my neighbors don't believe they're real? Don't you think I have rights here?" Sullivan shrugged uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to keep the peace. Sometimes the best solution is the one that makes everyone happy, even if it's not perfect for any one person." After the police left and the neighbors dispersed, Margaret sat in her darkened living room and realized that she was facing a choice that no one should ever have to make. She could either continue to honor her husband's memory in the way she felt was appropriate and risk escalating harassment that might eventually turn violent, or she could surrender to the bullies and remove the display that meant everything to her. As she sat there contemplating her limited options, Margaret had no way of knowing that her story was about to take a dramatic turn. Unbeknownst to her, one of her neighbors had been quietly documenting the harassment campaign and had reached out through military channels to report what was happening to the widow of Colonel James Chen. That report had made its way up through various military networks until it reached someone with both the authority and the moral conviction to intervene in a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. The unexpected intervention came on a Saturday morning when Margaret least expected it. She was in her kitchen making coffee and trying to summon the courage to face another day of hostile neighbors when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling into her driveway. Looking through her window, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat as she saw 3 black SUVs with government license plates parked outside her home. From the lead vehicle stepped a woman in an immaculate army dress uniform, her bearing unmistakably military despite her civilian setting. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the abundance of ribbons and decorations adorning the woman's chest, and the 3 silver stars on her shoulders that identified her as a lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. Behind the general emerged several other military personnel, including what appeared to be aides and a military chaplain. Their presence on quiet Maple Street was so unexpected and dramatic that neighbors began emerging from their homes to stare at the unprecedented scene unfolding on their normally peaceful suburban block. When Margaret answered her door, she found herself face-to-face with Lieutenant General Patricia Harrison, a woman whose reputation in military circles was legendary. General Harrison had commanded troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan, had been one of the first women to break through multiple barriers in Army leadership, and was known throughout the service as someone who never tolerated disrespect toward military families or veterans. "Mrs. Chen," General Harrison said, extending her hand with a firm, warm grip. "I'm General Patricia Harrison. I served with your husband James in Afghanistan, and I'm here because I learned about the unconscionable treatment you've been receiving from your neighbors." Margaret was so stunned she could barely speak. "General Harrison, please come in. I had no idea that James's situation had reached anyone in active service." As the general and her entourage entered Margaret's living room, General Harrison's eyes immediately went to the displays of James's military memorabilia. She approached the shadow box containing his medals with the reverence of someone who understood exactly what each decoration represented. "Mrs. Chen," the general said, examining the Purple Heart and Bronze Star with obvious familiarity, "your husband was one of the finest officers I had the privilege of serving alongside. His leadership during Operation Enduring Freedom saved countless lives, and these decorations represent genuine acts of heroism that I witnessed personally." General Harrison explained that word of Margaret's situation had reached her through military networks when a neighbor who had served in the Navy, unbeknownst to Margaret, had become disgusted with the harassment campaign and had reached out to veterans organizations for help. The story had eventually made its way to General Harrison, who had immediately recognized James's name and had decided to intervene personally. "Mrs. Chen," the general continued, "what's happening to you is not just an insult to your husband's memory. It's an attack on every military family that has sacrificed for this country. I'm here to set the record straight, and I brought some people with me who can help ensure this harassment ends immediately." By this time, word had spread through the neighborhood that something significant was happening at Margaret's house. Curious residents, including Patricia Williams, Tom Bradley, and Robert Martinez, had gathered on the sidewalk to observe the military vehicles and personnel. Their expressions ranged from nervous curiosity to obvious concern as they realized that Margaret's situation had attracted official attention. General Harrison stepped onto Margaret's front porch and addressed the gathering crowd with the command presence that had earned her 3 stars and the respect of soldiers around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the suburban street, "I am Lieutenant General Patricia Harrison, United States Army. I'm here today to address the disgraceful treatment that Mrs. Margaret Chen has received from some members of this community." The gathered neighbors shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that they were now facing someone whose authority was unquestionable and whose presence suggested that their campaign against Margaret had attracted official military attention. "Mrs. Chen is the widow of Colonel James Chen, a decorated combat veteran who served our nation with exceptional distinction for 30 years, General Harrison continued. "I had the honor of serving alongside Colonel Chen in Afghanistan, where his leadership and courage under fire saved the lives of countless American soldiers." She gestured toward Margaret's front window, where the disputed display of medals remained visible. Every decoration displayed in that window was earned through acts of genuine heroism and selfless service. Colonel Chen's Purple Heart was awarded after he was wounded while leading a rescue mission under heavy enemy fire. His Bronze Star recognizes his exceptional leadership during some of the most dangerous operations of our recent conflicts. Patricia Williams stepped forward from the crowd, her face flushed with embarrassment but still defiant. General, with all due respect, we had no way of knowing these things were real. There's so much fake military merchandise available these days, and the display seemed so elaborate. General Harrison's expression hardened as she fixed Patricia with a stare that had intimidated far more powerful people than a suburban homeowner. Ma'am, your ignorance is not Mrs. Chen's problem. Instead of making accusations based on your own prejudices and misconceptions, you could have simply asked to see Colonel Chen's service records, which Mrs. Chen would have gladly provided. Tom Bradley, who had been one of the most vocal critics of Margaret's display, spoke up nervously. General, we weren't trying to be disrespectful. We just thought that real veterans don't usually show off their medals like that. The general's response was swift and sharp. Sir, you have no authority to determine how military families should honor their fallen. Mrs. Chen has every right to display her husband's decorations in any manner she sees fit. The fact that you organized a harassment campaign against a military widow based on your own ignorant assumptions is both shameful and, frankly, potentially criminal. General Harrison then did something that stunned the entire neighborhood. She called forward one of her aides, who produced a large folded document from an official portfolio. With great ceremony, the general unfolded what turned out to be a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that can be awarded to a military unit that had been awarded to Colonel Chen's regiment for their actions in Afghanistan. This citation, General Harrison announced, was personally signed by the President of the United States in recognition of the extraordinary heroism displayed by Colonel Chen's unit. Mrs. Chen, your husband's name is specifically mentioned in this document for his leadership during the operation that earned this recognition. The general then called forward the military chaplain who had accompanied her. Chaplain Robert Martinez, a different Martinez than the Homeowners Association president, had served with James Chen during his final deployment and had been with him when he was wounded for the last time. I was there when Colonel Chen was injured, Chaplain Martinez told the assembled neighbors, his voice thick with emotion. I watched him refuse medical evacuation until all of his wounded soldiers had been treated first. I saw him continue to direct operations from a field hospital while medics worked to save his life. The man was a hero in every sense of the word, and the idea that anyone would question his service or harass his widow is absolutely unconscionable. The effect on the neighborhood crowd was immediate and dramatic. Patricia Williams began crying, whether from shame or genuine remorse. Tom Bradley stood with his head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Other neighbors who had participated in or passively supported the harassment campaign looked mortified as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. But General Harrison wasn't finished. She announced that she had already been in contact with the local police department to discuss the harassment and vandalism that Margaret had endured. She had also spoken with the Homeowners Association's regional headquarters to inform them about the inappropriate actions of their local representatives. Furthermore, the general continued, I want to make something absolutely clear to everyone present. Mrs. Chen has every legal right to display her husband's decorations, and any further harassment, intimidation, or vandalism directed toward her will be treated as a federal crime against a military family. I have the full authority of the United States Army behind me, and I will not hesitate to use it to protect Mrs. Chen's rights and dignity. The general then turned to address Margaret directly, speaking in a warmer tone that carried across the street. Mrs. Chen, your husband would be proud of the dignity with which you've handled this situation. You have honored his memory and his service, and you have the gratitude of everyone who understands the sacrifices that military families make. As a final gesture, General Harrison presented Margaret with a flag that had flown over military headquarters in Afghanistan, specifically in honor of Colonel James Chen. The ceremony was conducted with full military protocol, with the general and her staff rendering proper salutes while neighbors watched in stunned silence. After the formal presentation, General Harrison spent nearly an hour with Margaret, sharing stories about James's service and the impact he had on the soldiers under his command. She explained that James had been recommended for even higher decorations that had been delayed by bureaucratic processes, and she promised to personally ensure that those recognitions would be completed and delivered to Margaret. When the military entourage finally departed, the transformation in the neighborhood was immediate and complete. Patricia Williams was the first to approach Margaret's door, tears streaming down her face as she offered a heartfelt apology. Tom Bradley followed, mumbling that he was truly sorry, and asking if there was anything he could do to make amends. Even Robert Martinez from the Homeowners Association appeared at Margaret's door to formally withdraw all complaints against her display and to offer the association's full support for any security measures she might need. Over the following days, Margaret found herself overwhelmed by gestures of support and apology from neighbors who had either participated in the harassment or had failed to speak up against it. Her mailbox filled with cards of apology and flowers appeared daily in her garden. Several neighbors offered to help repair the damage that had been done to her car and property. More importantly, Margaret discovered that she had allies she never knew existed. The neighbor who had reached out through military channels to report her harassment turned out to be retired Navy Commander William Foster, who lived just 3 blocks away. Commander Foster and his wife became close friends, and through them Margaret connected with a network of military families in the area who understood and appreciated James's service. The story of General Harrison's intervention spread far beyond Maple Street. Local news outlets picked up the story, and it became a powerful example of how ignorance and prejudice could lead to the persecution of those who deserved honor and respect. The coverage led to educational programs about military service and the proper respect owed to veterans and their families. Margaret's front window display remained exactly as it had been, but now it was viewed with the reverence it had always deserved. Neighbors would point it out to visitors as a source of pride for their community rather than controversy. Children would stop to ask their parents about the medals, and Margaret began giving informal talks about military service and the sacrifices made by service families. 6 months after General Harrison's visit, Margaret received a call informing her that James had posthumously been awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the military's highest decorations for exceptional service. The award ceremony was conducted at the local Veterans Center, with General Harrison returning to personally present the medal to Margaret. This time, nearly the entire neighborhood attended to honor both James's memory and Margaret's dignity in the face of adversity. As Margaret placed the new decoration in the shadow box with James's other medals, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The harassment and persecution had been painful beyond words, but it had ultimately led to a broader recognition of James's service and had educated a community about the importance of respecting those who serve. Margaret Chen had started as a lonely widow, seeking peaceful retirement in a quiet neighborhood. Through persecution and redemption, she had become a respected member of a community that now understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Her husband's medals continued to shine in her front window, no longer symbols of controversy, but beacons of honor that reminded everyone who passed of the price of freedom and the dignity owed to those who pay it.